Okie dokie. The magic light bulb, the steampunk, clickety-clacks, clickety-clacks, clickety-clacks. The sound of machinery, the logos flying by. tortuganwordpress.com. And we are here on the latest episode of Evolution Hour. There's my razzle-dazzle steampunkish logo. tortuganwordpress.com. Everybody should have that on their smartphone and their PC and whatever else, and their stone tablets, so that they can get access to it, because that's where I'm doing all of this stuff, including this project here. We will now stop sharing and commence the exciting world of the latest hour of Evolution Hour. Hi, gang! I see we got some people in the peanut gallery, and I love questions. I'm all by myself today. Jackson couldn't show up, and a few others a little busy over there in the East Coast, so you're going to hear me. As those of you who have been following the last few weeks know, I have been analyzing this book, Contested Bones, by the creationists Christopher Rupe and John Sanford, who is the genetic entropy guy. And I'm trying to demonstrate how anybody, not just old farts like me, can go through. Brian says, Professor, how do you do? Oh, I wish I was a professor. No, I'm just a BA in history, but and I don't even pretend to be one on TV. So hi, Brian. Anyway, what I'm doing with this book, which was gifted to me by somebody who didn't want to have to read it themselves, and they said, well, would I look at it? So I'm doing it. The first thing you do in an analysis like this, from a source methods point of view, which I do in TIP all the time, is if you get a book like this, you don't look in the front, you look in the back first. And what you discover right off the bat, there's no index, there's no bibliography, there are footnotes along the way, so you can see, on this, you can see, yep, there are footnotes, yep, there are. But the question is, do they declare what they're supposed to or not? Do the sources say what the authors use them for? And do they contain information that is fairly represented in the content, or do they overlook stuff? Well, I'm actually doing an analysis of it. So I'm compiling a reference bibliography. I suppose I should do another little screen share here. Let me get my little magic button up in here, where I've been going through all of the primary sources. Whoop. You will now be seeing this little sheet here. This is Svante Pääbo, Neanderthal Man in Search of Lost Genomes. It's a book that I didn't have in my reference bibliography, but fortunately excerpts from it are available on Amazon, so I could check up on the pointed issue, which was Svante Pääbo, in case you don't recognize the guy with all the little umlauts in his name. He's one of the big figures in dating Neanderthals and Denisovans. He's, I think, from University of Uppsala or something up in Finland, somewhere in Scandinavia. And a very personable little fellow who has been very busily working out very meticulous ways with his team of scientists to work out what the DNA of ancient peoples and that were, when they can find examples of them. And the Neanderthals and the Denisovans were examples of it. Now, what I've done here is our creationists cited this particular page, 237, for this quote in black, this little part right here. And you can see. That's all they quoted. Well, I wanted to find out what it was on the context. And what they were doing is trying to imply that Neanderthals are just normal run-of-the-mill human beings. And the science has now reached around, because they've been interbreeding with humans, that they must ergo be actual human beings, and they're just the same species. So they quoted this little snippet here. Many would say that a species is a group of organisms that can produce fertile offsprings. From that perspective, we had shown that Neanderthals and modern humans were the same species. What they didn't do, or more precisely Rupe, because apparently he was the guy that did all the source material. However, this concept has its limitations. For example, polar bears and grizzlies can produce fertile offsprings, and so forth and so on. We don't know whether the fact that Neanderthals contributed perhaps 2 to 4% of the genes of many present-day humans meant that they were the same species, same or different species. So right in the very section they were nicking the authority quote from, they are misrepresenting the source. They're leaving out relevant information. And in fact, on the very next page, 238, Pääbo was describing the topic, which was about these Denisovans, not Neanderthals. He was saying the mitochondrial DNA of the Denisova individuals was about twice as different from the mtDNAs of modern humans as was the mtDNA of Neanderthals. That probably made them more like H. heidelbergensis, who did get to have their own Latin species name. So this was a discussion of taxonomy and systematics, not a layout of a contention that Neanderthals were simply the same species as humans. And this has been the common refrain of this chapter in this particular book, where they launch off with the Neanderthals. They wanted to go back to the nice, good old-fashioned notion of some creationists. Creationists have been in an awkward spot about Neanderthals from the get-go because they look very different from human beings in many respects. They have a much bigger brow ridge. The skull is different. They're very robust in their anatomy. And the general position was, morphologically, they varied so much from people, they weren't quite our species. The opposite perspective that started to pay attention to the genetics before we had mitochondrial DNA and other DNA directly from Neanderthals to be able to check this, had a broader definition of what species refers to. And we now knew more about antecedent species that were going on in the pre-human Homo erectus and all the rest. And so there was a small effort in the 70s and 80s to regard Neanderthals maybe as just a subspecies of human. But that kind of fell flat on its face once we got into the happy world of directly looking at mitochondrial and physical DNA from the Neanderthals. And we now know that we interbred, but not a lot. And still, there's enough anatomical difference and enough genetic difference that they can't really be treated as our species. They're a cousin species. And here, therefore, it goes right to the core of what it means to have speciation events, is that when you have a speciation events, you're going to have a squishy zone where it's almost. And once the species branches off as a separate species, this doesn't mean that they're instantly non-hybridizable. Hybridizable, I suppose there's a good word for that. And in fact, we know that in an awful lot of vertebrate species that can happen. So the idea, there's a concept, prezygotic isolation mechanism, which has been studied a lot in fruit flies. And Paulogia says Neanderthals are just people. I saw them in insurance commercials. Come on into the chat here. I always like to have you around, Paul, because you give a good feel of things, and you do way better videos, and you're more photogenic than I am. I can tell you that. But anyway, there had been a long-standing debate, and I went into it a lot in Planet of the Apes in the chapter at TIP. If you have my website, you can go to it and download it and read it at your convenience. It's about a book-length thing. Anyway, the debate between out of Africa versus multi-regional, and it was still kind of a up-in-the-air debate. That was starting to settle more for the out of Africa mode, that human species had originated in Africa and then spread out and replaced the native populations. Well, all this new Neanderthal and Denisova data and more fossil information that had come up to realize that the human hominid line was much bushier than we had thought, and more knowledge about how genetic flow moves, meant that it really shouldn't have surprised them that both sides were right and both sides were wrong. That no, there wasn't really intensely regional subspecies of humans. They were actually more allied species of humans like Neanderthal. But there was gene flow at the edges, and a little bit here, a little bit there. Over the course of the 10,000 or more years that humans interacted with Neanderthals, definitely, there were maybe only a couple hundred examples of boinking going on. And that was enough to generate the 2 to 4% of DNA that we find in the humans today. But you find it very little in African populations for that very reason. Now, one of the sources then that I put up as links, because you could get it direct as opposed to the Pabo book that you could just see excerpts of, related to these papers, there was a commentary piece by Ledford on this particular technical paper, Lalueza-Fox. Yeah, my tongue is tangled up. And this was being cited on the issue of Neanderthal skin pigmentation, and that there were some red-headed ones in the Neanderthals that we can now tell from the genes and so forth and so on, and a light skin pigmentation and others, and that the creationists were trying to give the impression, let's see if I can read their little section in here on it. Let me see, Finlayson. I'm suddenly getting boring here because I'm looking back on the, there we go. Note 58, yeah. Says, based upon these new findings, some museums have replaced their now outdated subhuman representation of Neanderthals with very human-looking ones featuring light eyes, pale skin with freckles and red hair. Figure 4, genetic traits indicated by DNA analysis published in Science, notes 58, 59. Well, I linked to both of the sources, 58 and 59, which was Lalueza-Fox et al. From 2007, and Ledford, the commentary at Nature, 2007. And if you follow that up, you'll discover exactly what I did. That, especially in the commentary, they flat out said, I suppose I should put my screen sharing up in here to get down, so you can see it too. And I always have to have trouble because I am an old fart and I'm just getting used to all this crap with these things. I'm not intuitive yet, and I have old stupid fingers. So let me jump down to this bibliography. There's Ledford. That's the paper, the commentary piece that they cited. And you can see this section here where I put a little highlight up. It's about the Neanderthal DNA. They were unsure about contamination, and they finally were identifying this MCR1 gene variant that is involving skin pigmentation. It's in 2 European Neanderthal fossils they studied, contained a single base pair change that seemed to be unique to Neanderthals. This is not occurring in human beings. This is a unique characteristic. In other words, their skin pigmentation variety was being produced independently and convergently. It was not something inherited or common to human beings. And down below was this Lalueza-Fox and Hofreiter note that the absence of the Neanderthal-specific MCR1 sequence in modern humans suggests that pale skin evolved independently in Neanderthals and humans rather than from interbreeding between the two. So this was yet more information that was explicitly indicating that human beings were not quite the same as our cute Neanderthals. And even though they had a much more sophisticated cognition, I put a linkage into another paper that the creationists cited, relating to use of feathers and perhaps bird bones, and that were being indicated by some of the remains that were found at Neanderthal sites, and that they might have been making use of birds in ritual context and all of that. The fascinating paper, and you can get up to speed on the interest. All they were doing in the creationist thing was just going, gee whiz, Neanderthals are just as smart as we are. But constantly, at every single opportunity where the technical literature or the commentary works were calling attention to differences in the Neanderthals, in skull anatomy, in physical anatomy, in the genetic data that were showing, no, they're not humans, they're almost humans, they're closely related to humans, close enough that they could hybridize. In every single instance so far, they have suppressed that information. And it's information directly in the sources that they cited. So source analysis is a pattern of behavior. It shows itself very rigorously. Anybody who hopefully looks at my works can source analyze me to death. Go ahead. I'm happy to. And somewhere along the line, I occasionally make mistakes, and I call attention to them. In fact, in that Planet of the Apes chapter, I made a goof in doing the initial draft of the work on tooth eruption patterns in Australopithecines, and the paleontologist up at the University of Toronto that was vetting the work called it to my attention and pointed out how I was wrong. And it was because I didn't have access to primary source papers on it. I relied on 3 secondary sources, but they were all wrong. They were dated. And so I called attention to my mistake and how it was that I managed to correct it, and you go about doing that. So it's not that nobody makes a mistake, but when you find a pattern of behavior of consistently ignoring relevant information right under your own nose, that's a problem. And that's the problem we're seeing in Rupe and Sanford. We've got BJ says, so that would be called convergent evolution. Yeah, convergence pops up all the time in biology. It's things where there are dynamic selection factors that produce outcomes or favor outcomes. If you're a fish or anything like a fish that swims in the water, there is a hydrodynamic selection, that if you're shaped like a block of wood, you're not going to be a fast swimmer. You need to have a hydrodynamic shape that will slice through the water very efficiently. And so ichthyosaurs and tuna and dolphins all end up with very streamlined body shapes and particular dynamic things in the way the cavitation forms or not in the flukes. And there's a whole bunch, and fins, even though they're very different in terms of swimming patterns. All the marine reptiles swim like this, and crocodiles and all of that. It's the way the muscles are attached in the archosaurs. Whereas mammals have a different muscle relationship. That's another where contingency has an effect. And so whales and dolphins swim like this, so that they're moving they're flexing their back up and down rather than side to side along the tail thing. But they still end up with very, very similar shapes because water doesn't change. And so there's a selection pressure for it. So we find a lot of examples, not only at gross levels like the hydrodynamic shapes, but at the genetic level of where different mutations, as was the case with this skin pigmentation thing, can produce the same effect that's being selected for, but by a slightly different mechanism. And you'll find that the overall gene structure will remain the same, but the individual mutations may be different. Or if you go deeper and deeper down into some biological functions, like a lot of the things relating to photosynthetic systems and others, that it turns out that there's very different outcomes can come from relatively the same dynamic system, or a different set of substrates can end up producing the convergence. You have the reverse of convergence in a way in the hair and feather example with mammals and birds, where they all have bone morphological protein and sonic hedgehog and keratin fibers, and all of the genes have a lot of the same pieces like Lego blocks. But because of the contingencies of history and the particular dynamics of the skin buckling in and out in the two versions, it ends up being hair on mammals and feather forms on birds. And so that's not a convergence, but it's kind of a very broad homology issue. So those are all the dynamics that go on that you find when you actually read the technical. Let's see what's going on over in here. Yes, we got some people talking more about convergent evolution, and also Pelagia and all the rest on there. Yeah, Pelagia says that I'm making dinner for the kiddos, always important, but that I have it, RJ. Well, I'm trying my best on this, yeah. So what we've got here in the source analysis thing, and what I'm trying to do to show that A, it's not rocket science, B, everybody can do it. I'm not running out of my house and going down to the library and scouring through technical papers with my magnifying glass, going, oh, now that I've found this technical paper, I will hand write down all the material so that I can take it back to my lair. Nope, mouse click, whoop, that's all it takes. You can find this material online. What I do in some cases, if the Ledford piece was cited by a direct web link rather than a technical citation. And so I had to basically type out the thing and copy and paste and all that stuff to locate it there. In my bibliography, I list it as a more regular source citation on there because it's from a journal rather than otherwise. But all of this stuff is openly accessible, and you can find it really fast. And the nice thing about that Google search menu is you can see where the topic is coming up elsewhere. You can find follow-up material, which isn't so important for a paper that's relatively recent, like something from 2012, but it can be kind of important if you're looking at something from 2007, which is over a decade ago. Science don't stop. And so they keep on working on to it. So, oh, Abe says, I love RJ's voices. Yes, I can do a few accents occasionally. Yes, I did a HAL 9000 voice recorder, telephone recorder message for Paul Enns and no, God, I forgot his name now. Anyway, and also I do a few other accents along the way. But I wish I could do a good James Mason. I can't quite pull him off. But most of the people that I can do are often dead, so I can't do that. So, if you want to hear my accent, you listen to Cy Strike's movie nights on Friday. I trot those out every once in a while. And then, of course, it's not really an accent, but when I always say Harun Yahya, I will go Harun Yahya, because I think it kind of fits. He's the nutball Islamic creationist that pops up in there. But anyway, I am digressing. So the point about the Rupe and Sanford Neanderthal discussion is that they have a very rigid perspective, which I'm expecting them to trot out more and more as we get farther down the line. And eventually they're going to have a section. I've deliberately avoided looking farther on in the book. Antifa says I do a poor Jimmy Stewart imitation. Most people do poor Jimmy Stewart impressions, actually. That's the sad thing about it. The best Jimmy Stewart impression is Jimmy Stewart. I'm digressing again on impression stuff. But anyway, the point about the thing is that creationists have a very rigid perspective. Human beings have to be their own special kind. No negotiation there. They can allow Neanderthals into the field, although there are a few idiosyncratic creationists that don't even do that. Then you've got that squishy group beforehand, the earlier Homo erectus bunch, and I'm going to be fun to see what they deal with all of that. And then going farther back in time, Homo habilis, and then even farther back to the Australopithecines, and then even farther back to more basal hominids. Oh, Jackson, you made it after all. You got through with dinner. How's everybody there in Louisiana?
Doing all right. How you doing?
Oh, well, I've been rattling on like I can do all by myself, but I like company. I like to have the feedback on things. And I knew you were interested in the subject, both from the source methods direction and also the Neanderthals are just a fascinating group. There's been a revolution. You're younger than I am, so I kind of like to know, what was your impression of what Neanderthals were like as you were growing up and also as you entered into the scientific realm? Because I'd be curious to know whether it differs a great deal from the impressions I got growing up in the ancient days of the 1950s and 60s.
Well, for me, it's always depended on who I talked to. Some people said, they were a subspecies of humans. Others say they were their own species. And so when I was in anthropology, I actually can't remember which position my anthropology teacher took on that question, but yeah,
it was fighting words there for a long time. So was the multi-regional debate. In some respects, as I pointed out a little bit earlier in the show, it's basically become redundant. That we now know much more about how gene flows through populations. We can see how there's a dance between mitochondrial DNA and the nuclear DNA. Oh gosh, I can never remember the stupid guy's name. He's a brilliant man, in fact. Starts with an S. It's not Salveron or something like that. But anyway, he's it could be Sullivan. Anyway, he did a lot of material on what seemed a boring subject, which is Pacific Northwest chipmunks and their hybridization zones. But it turned out to be one of the best lectures that I had heard in the EWU Darwin Day series. Was his absolutely fabulous discussion of how you could identify the selection pressures and dynamics. And you've bumped into this in some of the other areas that you had taken a look at in your own field, where the speciation process is this delicate balance between the gene flows that are going on. And then finally, things can start becoming zygotically isolated, and the mitochondrial DNA may still be shareable in certain, it wants to hold itself in the field, whereas the nuclear DNA is starting to veer away, and finally it reaches the point where the doors start closing. So you can see this in very specific populations, and how the geographical relationships that you can see as these hybridization zones are flowing back and forth before and after speciation events. Well, the same thing is going on in varying levels in all vertebrates, and it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on population size, it depends on population distribution, it depends on the particular way that their genes are constructed, whether or not you can get zygotic isolation mechanisms preferentially. I know from the fruit fly case, I mentioned this, I think, in chapter 1 of the old book. All of you, download my crap and put it on your access so that you can go reading through all of this stuff. I don't have an index, alas, for the old book, because it was intended as a book, and I was informed when I was trying to get publishers for it years ago that publishers don't like people doing their own indexes. And unfortunately, it shows because they get professional indexers to index it. Anyway, in the fruit fly case, you could literally see how you would have differential gene flow to where as the species start differentiating, there are times when you can have a female from one deme that will interbreed with the male of the other, but not the male of that deme interbreeding with the female of the other, or vice versa, so that you can get a partial zygotic isolation, so that you're still having gene flow along one of these gradients, but not on the other. And because mitochondria flows by the female line, not the male typically, there's going to be skewed in which direction you can deal with it. So they may be able to find out as time goes on, analyzing that mitochondrial DNA, theoretically, you might even be able to tell who was boinking who, whether or not it was more often than not a male of a Neanderthal with a female Homo sapien, or a female a Neanderthal with a male of that, and whether or not there might be that in the clues about the dynamics of the mitochondrial DNA. It may be that possible to deal with as they get more and more DNA samples from Neanderthals. So that's a kind of a purient interest thing that would actually have some interesting dynamics as to cultural interchanges. And then if you think through, even in terms of cognition, there are all these tantalizing cases of more advanced art and tools showing up in some Neanderthal contexts. And the issue is, are they inventing themselves and those get spread around to Homo sapiens, or are they picking them up culturally or not? And you might be able to differentiate between whether or not women were involved more in the conveyance of cultural information. We've already discovered a good circumstantial argument that when we're down to human beings, by the time we're talking about some of the cave art where they would blow ochre and stuff onto their the handprint, like their signature on the wall, that some of the hands are consistently smaller. And the impression is, the inference is, that it's women who are making a lot of the art in these caves, not necessarily all guys. And that's a fascinating little piece of inference that comes up.
What has Sanford said regarding the Neanderthals?
Oh, their argument, well, and remember, it's fun because neither one of them are paleoanthropologists.
Right.
Rupe is a biologist and Sanford is an air quotes genetics guy who's actually been published in it. But when I saw his stupid genetic entropy book, boy, it was thin. It was really superficial. I was really gobsmacked. I was expecting something way weightier. Snelling does more footnotes than this guy. But anyway, he's basically following Rupe's lead on this. And Rupe is clearly taking the stance that Neanderthals are just people that have unusually large brow ridge. He's even showed a picture of this Russian wrestler who has fairly Neanderthalish appearance. But if you look at the skull and if you look at the actual details of things, no, he doesn't. He just has larger brows. And that apparently has to do with brain formation and the growth of the brain during infancy. There's a whole bunch of dynamic factors that relate to that brow ridge. What that guy had, of course, that no Neanderthal has, is a bloody chin. That's a very distinctive human feature. And we're not entirely sure in the literature that I've seen whether or not it's just a stochastic element as opposed to anything that has any adaptive characteristics. And as Stephen Jay Gould would constantly have reminded us, don't assume everything is adaptive in nature. There are things that just happen by the luck of the draw, and the chin may be one of them. So they're basically taking the position that Neanderthals must be human beings. They're going to be in the human holobaramon. What exactly Adam and Eve look like is an issue that is most curious. And I rather suspect they're not going to do that. Yeah, jump in.
Oh, so they haven't made their position on Australopithecus sediba known yet?
Oh, they got a whole chapter on it. I'm looking forward later on, and I know you'll want to be in on that one.
Oh yeah,
I get around to that. Yeah, it was a really busy week. I had a whole bunch of material on my plate to research and plug into tip stuff on. I had found this quote. Creationist Online had lobbed this particular creationist paper on radiocarbon dating at me. It was a secondary source from 2003, and the only thing in it was this one quote from a quote mine stuff. It had all the characteristics of it from way back in 1969, and it wasn't even about the subject they were talking about. It was a misrepresentation. It just piqued my curiosity. So I researched a bit on the quote and tracked down some of the cases where they were dealing with it. So that occupied me for over a day on just that one. But yeah, he's got a whole section on of Sediba. And since we know that our good old friend creationist Todd Wood has lumped him in with the human species, I'm going to be curious to see whether or not he draws attention to that. I mean, remember, there's no index, there's no bibliography, so I just can't look up to see whether a paper is in there. And I hadn't wanted to look ahead. He's got a whole section as well. They've got a whole section on Homo habilis. There, I can anticipate their argument, because we don't have a clear picture of how the Australopithecines branched into Homo habilis, and then what happened after that. There's just not a lot of data going on, and Homo habilis is fairly fragmentary. I don't think we have any really good full skeletons, unlike what we have with Homo erectus and some of the Australopithecines. We do have some brain endocasts, though, and so one of the data points that I'll be seeing, do they bring up, is that Homo habilis, if they try to lump that as not human, they're going to have to deal with the fact that we know that Brokaw's area and Wernicke's area that are involved in language production in human beings are definitely known in the endocasts of Homo habilis. That's way back in the field. And if they then try to lump Homo habilis in with human beings, there's an awful lot of anatomical variation going on there. They've already stressed it with Neanderthal. Are they going to try to lump Homo habilis in with human beings too? So one way or the other, it's going to be fun, and I'm going to expect to see lots and lots of data parsing going on and seeing how much of the source material. By the way, you were in on some of the early shows here where I pointed out how his source usage was running about 2 citations per page average.
Yeah.
It's dropped to 1.5.
Interesting.
So as I go, he gets a lot of stuff that he repeats again and again and again. Usually for authority quotes. It's still running about 2/3 of the source citations of all types are for authority quotes, and about 1/3 of the technical literature that they're citing, they're making direct mistakes, like what I just delineated today with the, let's suppress the gene data on Neanderthal. Let me look over here on what's going on in the side chat here. There's an interesting issue that's brought up about BJ says, I'm sure females made tools for what they need to do. That's a very good point. That I think a lot of the analysis that went on in paleoanthropology in the old days, when it was really a male preserve, tended to focus on guys. And I think we're still a long way to go to overcome sexist presumptions about things. But we're making a lot of progress. And the more recent technical papers are paying much more attention to the fact that there were women too, and that although it had even been pointed out, Mithen, I think is his last name. I can't think of the first name right off the bat. He's written a wonderful book. It's in the tip bibliography on the Neanderthals, and surveyed the issues about one thing we do know that differentiates humans from Neanderthals is they seem to have a smaller trading network than humans. We can tell from a lot of the stuff from shells, from a particular stone forms, and the kinds of ochre and things they're making use of. This stuff isn't available everywhere. And so you have this, you can start building up networks of trade to find out how far afield is stuff coming into the culture. And what kind of animals are they eating? Or do they have any preferences for certain kinds of things over others? Or anything being done for ritual purposes? And we find that just the recent discovery of that apparent Neanderthal cave where they had arranged the stones in a circle. It's very primitive kind of a shrine thing, but you can't help but feel it had symbolic significance for them. And so there's the idea, if you're a lumper, if you're a creationist that wants Neanderthals on our side because they're so much like us, they got to do that. But what if they're not our species? That means an animal that is a hominid, almost human, but not yet human, has very sophisticated cognition independent of human beings. That's an enormously significant thing. And that applies way more than just to Neanderthals, because tool usage, I'm going to be very interested to see whether they talk about the tool usage of Homo erectus and even back to Homo habilis. because when you look at it chronologically, you get this progression of sophistication, sometimes a million years of boring before you get some new developments going on, but nevertheless progression. And because Sanford is a young Earth creationist, and I'm assuming Rupe is, the chronology matter is the shoe dropping. So far, they have made no attempts to dispute chronology, but they do have a chapter later on radiometric dating. So I think they'll probably start threading their way through that little landmine when we get down to that point. So there should be plenty of opportunities for further analysis of their source usage and their data stacking. And since neither one of them are radiometric dating or geology people either, they're going to be relying on an awful lot of secondary sources there too. Brian Stevens in the live chat says he feels that the circle is a natural fire pit shape, and they took that out of context. That's possible. That's why the material that's been done on all of these finds, you got to let the dust settle a lot. And it may turn out that it doesn't mean quite what they thought it was. For years, to take a non-hominid example, the Bernissart iguanodons were thought to have been masses of carcasses that had fallen down this crevasse, and some creationists were insisting, aha, this was the catastrophe in the flood, blah, blah. But in the 70s and 80s, new analyses went through and discovered that, no, that was just a misinterpretation of the data. And when they looked at it from a more rigorous taphonomic analysis about how bones develop and how they get compartmentalized inside of deposits and all the rest, turns out it was like in a bend in a river. And it just happened to catch an awful lot of iguanodon carcasses periodically. And those things ended up smooshed in. And then the landscape had altered completely and bent up so that it seemed as though it was in a crevasse when it wasn't. And it just shows you how popular iguanodons were at that time, because that was about the biggest critter that tended to get lobbed into the thing. Smaller stuff wouldn't be that way. So that pulled the rug out from under it. So yeah, Brian is quite right, to leave the question marks open on that. But the dust will eventually settle. You'll find more anthropologists getting into the thing. You'll have other people looking at it with fresh eyes, and they'll figure out more and more what's going on. And typically, things start coalescing into a consensus where people start figuring out, well, there's the thing. A new generation comes along. That's another factor. Why there's a reason why so many of the debates that were just fuming. Wolpoff was one of the biggest ones in the multi-regional model, and he's still active. Still truculent as all get out too. He's a prickly analyst. And then you've got Johansson and others that are in the out of Africa model, and then the geneticists are weighing in. And so now that they're coming into play and more data coming onto the field, we've got the new information that Homo sapiens, or at least almost Homo sapiens, may be much broader range than just in the southern part of Africa that they had thought before, that they were spread much more widely over Africa before the big surge out in with Homo erectus later on into, or had it taken place with Homo erectus. So they're going to have fun with this stuff. We know there's some missing fossil information because the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, they have their DNA now, and there are still tracers in our particularly Eurasian DNA that is something other than those. So we've got a now missing format. And there may reach the stage when paleogenomics will be able, in like 100 years from now, maybe less, may be able to actually start retroengineering some of these variations. If they know this DNA is different, what phenotypic variations are going to be caused by this as it cascades through the system? And we don't yet know enough about all the cis-regulatory levels and all that to be able to do that now. But it's kind of only a matter of time before you get even more inferences. In my own lifetime, the shift that I was seeing, I come from the period, just to return to the point that I'd asked you about, Jackson, is that Neanderthals were the brutish primitives, the cavemen, the archetypal caveman. And it was only in the 70s and 80s that you really started to seeing it filtering in more and more that no, there was something more complicated going on with them. And then I really started diving in the 80s and 90s into the big reevaluation of that. And that was, of course, the heyday of when the group, I can't remember the guy's name, oh gosh, starts with a D, I think, was one of the major pushers of the Homo sapiens neanderthalensis designation, and it never caught on. And I suspect it won't. Even Pabo in his book is dancing around that issue as well. And he pointedly, in that the lead up to the paragraph that I just read a little earlier, was explicitly saying that I don't want to get involved with that because you get bogged down in picking sides here. Just look at the morphology and the data and don't bother about making a big deal about this taxonomic designation because it's just going to get you into trouble. And it sounds like Pabo isn't one to go into all of that. Brian brings up a point. Brian Stevens, remember a case when the investigation of some odd tub shapes on an island led researchers to conclude religious vessels, and then when the natives finally 20 years later got consulted, turned out they were for soap making. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, you get a lot of that stuff. That always beware of the first person to do the analysis, whoever it is, especially if they've got particular philosophical axes to grind. Let the dust settle and see what else comes into the case. So another point that's a scholarly methods analysis. I missed my shameless plug. Let me put my shameless plug up here. I better put that out. Let me get that up to there. And old RJ goes through the same bloody little ritual of finding the damn screen share button. Okay. And we'll share that. There we go. Got to put tip patrons up. I should have done this about 10 minutes ago. And Stephen and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Snaggles, Benjamin Simpson. Yes, he was in our show today. Thank you. Alex Stone, Totus Real. I love that, Totus Real. I'm not sure if that's totals are real or death is real. I'm not sure how we derive that. Everett and Paul. Thank everybody. I've got my website here. Make sure that you've got that and are reading it and sharing it and talking about it. I can use all the buzz I can get. The Patreon site, although they're slow as molasses on dribbling out money. And so I've been more cravenly pointing out the GoFundMe.com DCGo as a way of getting stuff to me if you think the RJ deserves some support. And as a self-interested party here, I say, yeah, do that. So there we'll stop sharing. A shameless plug at the moment is over, and then we can get back to our main attraction on that. So it's fascinating, and most serious paleoanthropologists are really wary about trying to get into the mind of the extinct hominid. At the same time, there's a mind there. And you'd be not doing your job if you didn't ponder about it. I think the most useful approach in this area is tool usage. And I pay a big deal to this in the Planet of the Apes chapter. At tip, go to it, download it, blah, blah. On this tool formation thing, and it's only gotten more intricate since then. I'll have to comment with the thing in a second here. Is that the tool making thing tells you about how the mind is working, because to recreate the tool, you have to get into the mindset of the tool process. And it turns out there's a lot going on in the head in order to make a flint axe. And you have to envisage the stone, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can't avoid doing if you try to replicate it. So you can surmise that similar things had to have been going on to be successful at this, and that therefore there's selection pressure or dynamics going on, and you can infer stuff potentially about what's going on in the brain, about how pattern things are done, how eye-hand coordination, how memory retention, and whether or not language is involved in the teaching process. That's one that's one of the inferentials. And I've mentioned before, my suspicion is that language or proto-language is developing along with tool usage. And it involves the teaching process as well. And then later on, as a spandrel, begins to go into telling stories and making up things about gods and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, BJ says that then you got the idiot who says pyramids are grain silos. That is our Secretary of Health and Human Services, or no, HUD, Mr. Ben Carson, who is a disgrace to sentient vertebrates everywhere and is serving in the government. He is a Adventist creationist. I'm not sure if he's a young Earth creationist, because Sleepy Time Ben doesn't really think very closely.
I'm almost certain he's a young Earth creationist.
It wouldn't surprise me, but I haven't heard him explicitly say so.
Oh, he put out a video like a while back that's like 45 minutes long, where he just talks about how wrong evolution is, of course, throwing out every possible fallacy that there is, an antiquated argument.
Oh, well, old Earth creationists can do that too. And because I haven't heard him explicitly talk about radiometric dating. If he does that, then he's a young Earth creationist. If he challenges the Big Bang, he would be a young Earth creationist, most likely. But just an awful lot of the tropes that you would find on evolution would be shared with you, Ross, at old Earth creationism land and intelligent designers. His particular apologetics are probably riffing off of Adventist stuff. Although even the Adventist Church apparently put out a thing saying that some of his notions on Adventist theology are wrong. So he's an oddball from that respect.
Adventists the other day, weren't we, RJ?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, they're the source of young Earth creationism. But not all modern Adventists are doctrinally young Earth creationists currently, and they've kind of squished around. So I always give people the benefit of the doubt in my analysis, unless I have an explicit indication of them jumping off the YEC gangplank. I classify them as not YEC, and so that means it's a rigorous measure. Whereas others, Paul Nelson at the Discovery Institute is never identified as a young Earth creationist, but I have him listed in the young Earth creationist category because he is one, and he's explicitly said so, and he's never given it up either. He just keeps it down on the down low. So even though the vast majority of his work is generic intelligent design stuff, he's over in the column of young Earth creationism for my spreadsheet analysis. Anyway, yeah, that's Secretary Ben Carson is why source methods matter, why people who get into elected office or appointed for things, their belief systems and their source methodology ultimately has impact, so that people in interacting with housing and urban development are going to be bumping into a guy who thinks that the pyramids were a grain silo, and also who apparently was really anxious to have an expensive dinner table. Why does the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development need a dinner table at all? Is he holding soirees a lot that he can't use a normal person's table? This was like $6,000. I was flabbergasted. And then he immediately blamed it on the wife. So he's a sexist creationist nincompoop. So wow, this is a strange world we live in. I was hoping we would be more adult than this in 2018, but I'm afraid that we are going through this darkness, and everybody's going to have to pull together on it. That's BJ says Seventh Days taught me a lot of silly stuff. It pops up a lot in peripheral grassroots apologetics. In local secular groups, I bumped into ex-Adventists, and Adventists have a lot of weird lore. The idea that dinosaurs were made up and fake, that pops up in a lot of Adventist homeschooling. It isn't an Adventist doctrine. It's not contended that way, but it shows up in the grassroots. And so you always have to differentiate between what the official position is and what the de facto grassroots people think, even within that demographic. It can get murky, and you need like a scorecard. As Jackson, I'm sure, has noticed, and I think anybody that gets involved in studying anti-evolutionism discovers that it's a broad and diversely weird field, and sometimes it bumps into an area. I know you have an interest in cryptozoology. Young Earth creationists intersect that because they want to have living dinosaurs. Yeah, and so
they're very, very selective with which cryptids are still alive. You look at things like, the elephant snake or what is it, Ngobu or whatever. No, those guys don't exist. The Flatwoods monster. Oh, but Mokelima, Bembe, Nessie,
yeah,
dinosaurs.
They look dinosaur-y. They look Mesozoic-y enough that they want that. And you'll notice you won't find young Earth creationists that when they're sucking off of cryptozoology, they don't care anything at all about Bigfoot, because that's skirting the human Barrowman. So they'd rather not think about that little puppy. So Yeti is off their scope.
The Ica stones, they're very selective with the Ica stones, which have pictures of like dragons and ancient aliens and things like that.
Yeah.
Of course,
it's a weird. There's a long weird connection because the earliest versions of these things started popping up in the 1950s and 60s, and I alluded to it very briefly in Slam Dunk because I felt it was an important little blip to have on the scope, so that anybody who didn't know anything at all about the creation evolution issue would have a sampler of woo in the course of talking about all the reptile mammal transition stuff. But then it goes through iterations, and apparently they're still chopping that stuff out today. And you can pretty much measure the level of scholarship of anybody who takes those things seriously. They're down in they're bottom feeders. These are people that just really want stuff to be true, and they rely upon websites.
Yeah, I mean, but the guy I talked to on my channel, Dave Witzel, he on his stuff, you know, he does on his website, which is all about cryptozoology. Actually, a few of his pages, at least one that I know of, appear on Answers in Genesis.
Yeah, again, yeah, there's a cross-fertilization down there at the grassroots. And cryptozoology, in Dinomania, I alluded to some of that stuff down, mainly in the footnotes in that. And you find Robert Childress, who is a kind of a wackaloon ancient astronaut groupie that bumps you into, God, can't think of his name right off the bat, with the Blauvels bunch and all that. I'll think of his name eventually. Starts with an H. They've got this super duper advanced science culture thing. So there's aspects of this that connects up with Atlantis lore. And you'll find seat of the pants grassroots creationists can be remarkably inventive in putting all of this syncretic pieces together. There was somebody that was a lesbian Christian creationist ancient civilization groupie person. It was the weirdest mishmash of stuff that this was not going to cause a typical group to form because it was far too specialized. But you'll find a scattering on Twitter of, I've got thousands of people I bumped into on Twitter already, and I keep a little column so that I can remember what the hell they were talking about. And maybe 5 or 6 will be out of that couple, 3,000 or so, are ones that are basically making up shit. They're inventing their own version of things. So they have their own version of the Bible. They have their own version of creationism. They're playing smorgasbordy and coming up with all sorts of things all on their own. And you'll find about Nephilim and demonic UFOs and all sorts of stuff popping up.
Yeah, alien intrusion.
Yeah, and that reflects a modest group. There's the it goes all the way back into the 1960s and 70s, and in fact, the weirdest connections, because Bill Dembski, in his scholarly book 2002, who was offering an example of a creationist description of things to act as a contrast to the regular science thing. And this was published by Cambridge University Press. This is one of Dembski's early books. And the source he picked as the quote jumped out at me because it was Wilson and I can't remember the other co-author guy, but it's a book on demonic UFOs. It's not a typical creationist book to use. You'd use Henry Morris or somebody like that, Gary Parker maybe, as an exemplar, Dwayne Gish. But so he's picking out Wilson, and that was telling us a little something about Dembski's reading list, that he would have even encountered that kind of an oddball argument and then thought to use it as typical. So source methods analysis is fascinating because you peek under the hood of what goes on in their head. When you read the sources that I put up as linkages, and you can do this with anything, you don't have to depend on me to do that. Whenever you look at any source, you can look up the stuff. You find out, because you're reading the full text and they cited the text. Maybe they didn't read it thoroughly. We don't know. But they're now on a divide. Yeah, jump in.
Well, we know the sort of science fiction reading that Ken Ham does when he's writing his books, his answer books.
Yeah, they're drawing on Jurassic Park as a source. Well, that poor little Dr. Gaiman, who was drawing on South Park as a source for the persecution of Christians, and you're going, what?
Yeah, did you see my talk with him?
Yeah, the poor little guy, he hasn't yet learned his lessons. He needs to pull back because it sounds like he's back to his old thing, and that is not a good sign, because it's very hard to isolate methodology and attitude unless you actually ask. And that's why source methods is so beautifully useful. It's the hardest thing to do because our nature is to present our side and to offer our evidence and to offer our position. And the hardest thing to do is to pay close attention to the other person's position, the other person's argument, the other person's sources. And it's not merely as a matter of dismissal, it's a matter of analyzing the core structure of things. Anybody who complains about young earth creationists relying on secondary sources too much, if they're relying on secondary sources too much, then that's hypocrisy. So it's ideally a thing that will spur us all to draw upon the primary source data more often. And we can do it.
So I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No. Go ahead. I run on and on.
Well, I enjoy hearing you talk about this stuff. The guy we were talking to, the Adventist, I forget his name, was like Arminian something. Anyways, he kept asking, he was asking me for sources, I think, and I was asking him for sources, and then he would send me like all these secondary sources, and then I would send him technical sources, and he was kind of not seeing the importance of of sending technical sources.
Yeah, and this is literally true. I'm not when I've looked at, because I've studied such a broad range of anti-evolutionists over such a long range of time, where remember 95% do not cite primary sources at all, and 2/3 of the ones who do cite primary sources are just copying them from somebody else.
Oh yeah,
so it's pathological. Literally, when they look at a secondary source that says what they want to be true, like that creationist did with the 2003 thing on radiocarbon dating, it's just from a website. It's not a technical thing. It doesn't even cite any technical literature. It says something that they want to be true, and it becomes true for them.
Yeah, the guy I was talking, that guy that we were talking to, he was arguing with me about whether Australopithecines are related to humans, because it started off, he said, give me an example of, a new species forming. I did. Then he said, give me an example of a new genus forming. And so I told him about Australopithecines transitioning into Homo. So he found a technical paper that was titled, I think, Australopithecus to Homo, the transition that wasn't. And this was from like 2016. So I was very intrigued by the title. But as soon as I started reading the paper, I realized it wasn't about Australopithecus not being related to Homo. It was about the features of Homo already being present in Australopithecines. And so I asked him, I said, you didn't actually read the paper you cited, did you? And then he kind of jumped off that claim and then said, give me an example of a family becoming a new family.
Yeah, you'll notice how when pressed really far, that's the dodge. You get the deer in the headlight silence. It's that they won't bear false witness. And so if you put them onto things where, did you fact check this stuff? Did you read it? They don't want to tell you flat out no, because even their minds know that isn't going to sound good. So they'll suddenly drop the subject. And that's when you know you've hit pay dirt, because you're now probing the very basement of their methodology. The other factor has to do with curiosity, the extent to which, if I can find it, I'm an old fart with a mouse Googling. If I can find this information, anybody can find this information. So if I can find it, why can't they? Why aren't they looking for this information on their own? So always beware of those rhetorical questions that are a way of deflecting. Sometimes you can turn the rhetorical question on its end and say, what makes you think that that's true? And focus back on the material. So what I envisage the source methods as a vice. You've got the actual data field here, and you've got their source methods here, and you can squeeze the two together by showing that their source base doesn't match the data field at all. And they're just going to go like the banana out of the peel when you put those two aspects together. But if you miss their side of the equation, you can't do that squashing. All they can do is have dueling authority quotes, and they say, well, you have your sources and I have mine.
Oh, I hate that. Because I have to explain to them why their papers, and I often cite Troubles in Paradise. We tell them, hey, no, these guys are actually missing most of the data, and we can show that they do this. One example I did that was for a guy who commented on one of my YouTube videos, and we were arguing about bird evolution, about birds being evolved from theropod dinosaurs. So he sent me first a bunch of creationist sources, not a single technical source, and not one of the technical sources, or sorry, not one of his creationist sources, mentioned any of the other theropods besides Archaeopteryx. They mentioned Archaeopteryx, Proto-Avis, and Archaeoraptor, and that was it.
And they didn't mention exactly where they're getting that from, too.
Yeah. They didn't mention Anchiornis, Auronis, Shautingia, Balar, or Genfangopteryx, or any of the other theropod dinosaurs.
In Dinomania, I had already noted how there was this extraordinary reluctance for anti-evolutionists, not just young Earth creationists. Intelligent designers make the same mistake. They don't really pay any attention to all the stuff after Archaeopteryx, because there's a whole Cretaceous period. Birds are developing and doing interesting things, and they'd already been finding a hell of a lot by 2005. Well, it's only got worse in the years since 2005, and you still find them not paying a hell of a lot of attention to it. Yeah, thank you, Cap. Yes, he already has got it. And a second one for a friend of mine. Yeah, I'm telling everybody out there, get Evolution Slam Dunk, because that's a moneymaker for the old RJ, and you will not be disappointed with the content. It's my kick butt contribution, because I deliberately wrote it to fill a hole in our defense wall, because there had been no proper discussion of the reptile-mammal transition in the pro-science department. It was in isolated things. There were technical works that you were finding difficult to get to. It was only occasionally mentioned in the Jerry Coyne devotes a paragraph to it, blah, blah. No, it needs to be way better. And we need to analyze how anti-evolutionists cover it. And so that's a full court press analysis of the material. Well, we're past 6 o'clock here. And I'll try to do then a summary of this installment of Rupe and Sanford. Short form is they're stupid. The longer form is that the bad practices that I've been observing have continued, that they're relying on sources for authority quotes. They are missing big chunks of contrary data, literally under their own noses. And so they're still running very badly on terms when they are bumping into the data field on the technical front, a relatively limited number of technical papers so far anyway, and that they're getting a third of the data wrong. And the rest of it's non-controversial. So they have yet to really pull out any smoking guns yet in the technical literature to support their version of things. And what I'm suspecting their argument will be is that all of that will be an apologetic set of stepping stones, a set of presuppositional guidance to get you to the spot where they want to be when they finally tell us what it is they kind of think happened with evolution and the origin of humans and non-humans. And that they won't really have made this clear enough in their own conception, and therefore they will never have actually offered a rigorous case for their position. It will be all essentially a nitpicking authority quote negative argument, a God of the gaps argument. So I'll find out how well that goes up and the extent to which they cite any creationist material, the baraminology work on there, because if they avoid their own side, that's an interesting omission, because are they saying they're afraid to use their own creationist side, or that they think it's bad and incompetent? And either one of those is not a particularly a wonderful thing to deal with. So we're about ready to shut down, and Beach is maybe skedaddling off, and a few others. Everybody keep spreading word about the project. I'd like to thank Jackson for coming today, and I'm glad you were able to make it for a portion of the show.
Me too. I always enjoy coming on.
Yeah, it's a big field there. What the big thing that I'm still not seeing yet, and may never happen, but boy, I'd like to see it, is a much tighter connections for a science strike force network of enthusiasts. That we have all the skills needed We have all of the people available by numbers and by information, and the information is accessible, and it can be done at no cost for all practical purposes. I mean, the thing I'm doing here is literally no cost. I have a camera that was gifted to me. I've got no cost requiring. I don't have to pay anything to be on YouTube. I'm not getting money for being on YouTube, but nevertheless, I'm not being paid for it. I don't have to pay for it. And so all this stuff is things that anybody can do, and that we can marshal ourselves so that no creationist or woo believer can ever stick their head up anywhere without somebody locally being able to boop, and react to them. And I'm still later on in the year, when that creation convention happens over in Seattle, they've got the dates settled. I think it's the 15th and 16th of October, but they haven't set a venue yet. I want to be able to do with local secularists over on the coast to do an enfilade at their organization and responses. And the way that I want to do it is very, very different from the kind of approaches P.C. Myers was taking, although some of that, which having counter demonstrations and speeches, is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's awkwarder to do properly. One thing I definitely want to avoid is, if we have any talks going on during their convention, we don't want to be at the same time as their speakers. We don't want to draw people away from their show. No, no, no. We want to be at their show and be at our show. So we would deliberately want to have our speakers that they would be easily accessible, and you would be able to attend both, because you want to be there to bear witness for the science on their turf, as well as inviting them, come into our turf. We're happy to have you, and we'll be talking, and we will be dealing with source methods. So it's a different approach. Instead of being, don't go in there, listen to us. No, no, go in there, listen to them, and listen to us, and make up your own mind and do your own investigation. So that's the grand plan that I'll see what we can come up with. And how we can deal with stuff that will be put up on YouTube, so people can see all of this stuff. So you can, again, visually see how you can approach these matters in a way that's non-confrontational and kind of funny, and at the same time gets the points across effectively. It's a new way of doing it, because not many people use source methods. So anyway, thank you very much for being here, and keep spreading the word about all of that. And Brian says, thinking a special server for that is what is needed, RJ. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things. I'm still very much feeling around at the I'm new at this gang. I'm an old fart from the 20th century. I can remember dial telephones and rabbit ears and antennas on the television sets. So this is an amazing ability to be able to communicate with people literally all over the planet. Anybody that wants to jump in can see my stuff anytime, any day, at their leisure. They can comment, they can put things in, and of course, anybody that comments on my video, I'm going to potentially comment back. So bear that in mind. It's a new venue to deal with. I'd like to thank SciStrike for pushing me into this, because he said that I should really be doing this sort of thing, and I'm happy to be doing so. And thanks for Jackson, who I learn an enormous amount, a lot from. You're an annoying person, Jackson. Every time I vet your video lecture, your text, I have to put more sources into tip, because there's stuff I discovered that I didn't know about before.
Well, I'm learning a lot for this next video, even though it's kind of a crappy subject, but we'll get there.
Oh, coprolites?
All right. Yes, coprolites.
You think you're going to slip a pun like that past me and I'm not going to notice, Jackson? Yeah, that is actually one of the delicious, if I can use that word to describe chip, topics, because it's telling you what animals eat. And it tells you about ecological relationships. It tells you about predator-prey relationships. There's a huge cascade of information in coprolites. And although it's a mucky subject to deal with, even in fossilized form, it's a fabulous subject. And it was no coincidence, I think, that Christine Janis was most delighted by the coprolite papers that I'd found on Permian therapsid hair that she didn't know about, that she was putting into her new book as a result of that. So that's all that stuff in Evolution Slam Dunk, gang, that you can find in there. So anyway, I will be shutting the show off. We're past the hour on here. And thank you very much, Jackson, for being able to make it. I hope this was an informative show. I hope you'll be staying tuned to the next installment, where we will continuing our saga of filleting creationists. Rupe and Sanford, we're only coming along on it. And everybody keep in touch and stay safe and have fun and learn shit, because we got so much stuff out there we can discover.